So welcome back, and we're talking about energy resources still. And I said that we're gonna explore how our society is built on this premise of having access to cheap oil, cheap energy. This is the map of Chicago and the suburbs in 1950. So here is downtown Chicago. This would be Schaumburg right up here, right? Elgin. Here's Waukegan, the north side. And the areas that are built in red were built up. They had houses. These areas were still farms, the kind of light tan area, 1950. And compare that to today. And notice how much more is red. And let's go back. So this right here is how you would go to the airport. This is where O'Hare Airport is today. And at the time, it was still mostly farmland. Out here is Schaumburg. And what changes? What changes? Well, cars. In the 1950s, cars were common, but not so much. Today, the average American household has 2.5 cars, which is a pretty interesting fact. Um, if you have a car and you live right here, you can get downtown or to any other area pretty quickly. But before then, if cars weren't common, people had to use trains. And so you see these kind of like fingers of cities going out. These were train lines, metro lines. You could take the train into work. So if you're working downtown and you're out here in what's now Elgin, or this would be probably Wheaton, you could take the train downtown and work in 1950. If you had to take your car, that was a long drive, and not many people had cars. But once you start making cars available, in the 1950s to the 1960s, the use of cars explodes, and now it allows the city to grow. All of this growth is built on the fact that you can use your car to get somewhere. Now, many of us live in the city, know what it's like not to have a car, and so we're used to using public transportation. But out here in these suburbs, that is dependent. You need a car. If you've ever lived in a suburb outside of the city, right, some of these areas don't even have sidewalks because nobody walks. Everything is too spaced out. So imagine this map and let's say 2150, 100 years, let's say 2120, 100 years from now. But now 100 years from now, gas, if you adjust for inflation, is $35 a gallon. How many people are going to be driving cars individually? Probably none. You might see buses, you'll see trains. Do you think the settlement patterns will change? Right? And so this is basically a snapshot of the United States. Most of our large cities and our growth in this country has occurred because of the automobile. Another thing that has happened, and maybe you've all read this title, this idea of small, more energy efficient cars using less gas. I love these cars called the smart car. They're actually not very smart, but they look cute. But another thing is fracking. So in our country, United States, we use a lot of oil. I mean, that shouldn't come as a shock. We all use cars. We are one of the number one user of oil in the country, in the world. Most people don't know this. We are actually one of the top 5 producers of oil in the world as well. We produce a lot of oil, but we use so much more that we have to import as well. But we only have so much oil, and so it's more expensive to buy oil from other places. And in the 1990s, the oil that we had, the amount that we had was beginning to drop. And economists were worried because if we have less oil of our own, we have to buy it from somewhere else. It's going to raise the cost of buying oil. It's going to raise the cost of energy, and that could have very severe consequences on our economy. I will ask this: if you think about wars, right? Where has the United States been fighting wars for the last 40 years? It's been the Persian Gulf and Afghanistan. And outside of take away Afghanistan, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, why are we there? I gotta tell you, if there was no oil there, I kind of wonder if we would be there, right? But this is what we call the oil crunch. That there is this gap between how much oil we need to use and how much we can supply. So U.S. companies began to look for oil they would normally not drill for. Things that were too expensive now are becoming more affordable because if gas was $2 a gallon and it cost you $3 a gallon to mine this gas, you're not going for it. But now people are paying $3.50 a gallon, $4.50 a gallon. And so that's allowing people to look for gas. And fracking is a way of doing this. Another thing we've done, we talked about this, that people are drilling for gas offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, further and further out in the water. But fracking has really come to represent this new way of doing it. And fracking is hydraulic fracturing. That's where the word fracking comes from. What happens is this. These areas in the United States that are covered in orange and red have the potential for natural gas and oil extraction that previously was too expensive. Fracking would allow this to happen. And what happens is we've gotten so much more oil from fracking that we've pushed peak oil into the future. We found more oil. And that may be great, but there are some issues. I'm going to let you see this link on your own. You can go ahead and there's a link right here also in your folder for these folders. Take a look at that. Another thing that happens with fracking is air pollution. So when we dig for fracking, we do air. Sometimes the natural gas that we're trying to dig escapes. What's the problem with that? Natural gas, specifically methane, is a greenhouse gas. Another thing is fracking can cause earthquakes. So right here, these are earthquakes in Oklahoma. We don't think of Oklahoma as a center of earthquakes, but the number of earthquakes that are getting larger, if you noticed, has risen. Because one thing is with fracking is basically fracturing rocks underground and taking out the natural gas. You basically are breaking up rocks underground and the ground settles. And in Oklahoma, it's become such an issue that a few years back, they had to pass a law requiring insurance companies to offer earthquake insurance. So Oklahoma and earthquakes, not what you would think. So let's go back to that idea of growth. Are there limits to growth, right? And the initial argument was, well, there's going to be limits because there's only so much of a demand, but that's not quite true. The real issue is that, yes, there are limits to growth because there seems to be limits to resources, but we seem to find ways to overcome that by paying more for them or creating new technology. So the real issue is that if we continue to grow using the way that we are, using the economic activity and the minerals that we are, that there are some severe costs. It's going to cost more, not only monetarily, but there are negative costs and health consequences, earthquakes, pollution, right? And so this just goes to the idea that maybe there is an ultimate law above that, and that the real single law of resource use is that you have to pay a price for what you get, right? So in other words, gas may cost more because we want it, but those costs are going to be shifted. And so right now, maybe we're paying the price for gas, but in the future, as we dig deeper and deeper, places that never had earthquakes are going to have earthquakes, like Oklahoma. The pollution around the world is going to increase as we continue to live a lifestyle that uses these resources. In other words, we can push costs around. So we can dig for oil offshore. We can, mine for gas in Oklahoma, and maybe that doesn't affect us. But in the end, right, the world is a closed system, and any negative aspects of growth are eventually going to affect the entire world. So in other words, there are always going to be costs and benefits and negatives and positives, but we can't push the negatives any further away than Earth. And so that's something to really consider. We can continue to use fossil fuels, and we can continue to make them more efficient, but they're still going to be causing issues with pollution. And we may push them away so that we're not so dirty with the air here, but that just is affecting someone else in the world. It's a closed system. And on that lovely note, I'm going to say have a good afternoon. And again, read these notes for your summaries, and I'll see you in Chapter 6.